In both literature and folklore, undead monsters are created when the deceased has some unfinished business, a wrong that's left to right, a loved one that's left to visit, or a project that needs completion. When we consider the fact that death is always inconvenient, however, that it never exactly arrives on a schedule to the deceased's liking, it raises a weird question. Why shouldn't everyone become an undead monster? Everyone who dies, after all, dies with unfinished business. So if that was all it took to become a ghost or a revenant, we should expect a society that's positively teeming with ghouls and ghosts. We should expect, in other words, a necropolis. Or more specifically, a fantasy necropolis. Or even more specifically, a city that's ruled by the undead, populated by the undead, and organized toward furthering the purposes of those undead. And when fantasy necropoli appear in literature or folklore, they're often ruled by some kind of evil or monstrous figure, a devil or something from beyond the stars, or death itself, the Grim Reaper. We're going to take the idea of a fantasy necropolis, complete with that of a monstrous ruler, and let it influence our adventure for today. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and we're going to explore the Ravenloft Domain of Dread called Necropolis. A land that's infused with negative energy to the point that living things cannot survive there. Everything in Necropolis is undead. The people, the animals, the plants, the microbes, everything. And ruling over it all is a negative energy elemental that calls itself death. As with all my Ravenloft videos, we're going to talk about what this domain is, list some media to help us get an imaginative grip on the domain, and then sketch out an adventure. In this case, our adventure is going to take place across 3 acts, taking PCs from levels 5 through level 7. That is, they will complete the adventure at level 7, and then once they're finished with the adventure, level up to 8 with DM's permission. This adventure uses materials from Nerdarchy's Out of the Box, Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, and the Merkborg supplement Heretic, specifically Graves Left Wanting. Before we dive into all that, though, what is the domain of Necropolis? Well, Necropolis is a city of entropy and slow dissolution. The city itself is slowly falling into disrepair, while the undead within it are tearing their society apart. Skeletons and zombies compose the vast majority of Necropolis's population, followed by ghouls. Its ruler, a cloaked negative energy elemental that calls itself death, is a horrifying sight. The only solid parts of its body are its fleshless skull and hands, which float unsupported in a cloak-like body of shadowy mist. Cold ashes fall with every movement, and its hollow voice resonates like thunder. Yet Death was once a human priest, a lich's ill-fated test subject. Today, despite his Grim Reaper appearance, Death has almost completely wiped the memories of his life as Llewellyn Dasheen, replacing them with his monstrous fantasy persona. Yet Death cannot purge its memories completely, and they relentlessly torment him. So Necropolis is a domain populated exclusively by the undead. They wander and shamble about, occasionally but not always imitating their former lives, and they often fall into conflict, both with each other and with the inanimate objects that they bump into and collide with. It's almost the opposite of an organized society. It's constantly crumbling and falling away. And ruling over it all is a creature that hopes to forget his humanity, but is unable to. This creature used to be a human priest named Llewellyn Dasheen, who was a disciple of the Lich King Azalin, the former Dark Lord of Darkon. Azalin was conditioning Llewellyn Dasheen in order to turn him into a new living vessel for his own soul. But when the time came for the real soul transfer, the experiment failed. Llewellyn was then transformed into this incorporeal, undead, negative energy elemental thing. Monster. Since he looks like the Grim Reaper and can command undead, Llewellyn thinks that he's literally the avatar of death. He thinks he's the Grim Reaper. Or he wants to be. Again, he's tormented by that fact that he knows that he lived a human life, so this can't be true. Anyway, to give us a handle on the domain of Necropolis, here are a few bits of influential media. First, I want to recommend the 1898 story by Frank Stockton, The Philosophy of Relative Existences. Don't let the title fool you. This isn't some sophisticated treatise about a metaphysical idea or two. It's actually a humorous story about the author of one of those things. I picked this story because it has a fun little rumination on what a city of dead people might be like, or rather a city of undead people. Stockton was famously a humorist, and this story has a couple of very silly moments too. There's also the 1932 short story by Clark Ashton Smith, The Empire of the Necromancers. This must be the third or fourth time I've recommended this story in a list of influential media for a Ravenloft video, but there's a good reason for that. In my opinion, we get our idea of the fantasy necromancer from Clark Ashton Smith's work, and more specifically from this short story, as well as some other stories in his Zothique cycle. You can pick up all of his Zothique stories in one convenient volume that's published by Hippocampus Press, in fact, so you might want to pick that up if you're interested. But yeah, Empire of the Necromancers depicts this society where everybody is undead, except for the necromancers that rule everything. It's a pretty good picture of what Necropolis might be like. And when it comes to the ruler of Necropolis, we must give some attention to Ingmar Bergman's 1957 film The Seventh Seal, a masterpiece of modern cinema and one of the most effective portrayals of death as an anthropomorphic figure. Just as the figure in the film is a metaphorical representation of death as a phenomenon or a power in the world, so is all of Death's dialogue similarly metaphorical, commenting on the relationship between us and mortality. It's very deep, but if you're gonna run a Necropolis adventure and you want to draw deep, draw from this. Use the personality of Death from this film to inform the Dark Lord's personality. There's also Wraith the Oblivion. This is an old role-playing game. It was originally published by White Wolf along with Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, Monster: the verb nominalization, and it presents a really cool and really creative, a really compelling, in fact, portrayal of the lives of the undead. There's a really neat metaphysical system for how undead creatures would have to persist and what anchors their existence. It kind of reminds me of Tanith Lee's Kill the Dead, or the rules that Tanith Lee comes up with for ghosts in that book, which I also recommend. As far as classic Ravenloft information is concerned, you should look at Lisa Smedman's adventure Death Triumphant. This is from 1996 and is part of a trio of adventures, which together tell the story of the creation of Necropolis. Oh yes, if I haven't mentioned already, Necropolis is an older domain from previous editions of Ravenloft. It isn't in Van Richten's guide. There's also the Ravenloft Gazetteer Volume 2 from 2003. This has a whole entry on Necropolis, which is pretty helpful. I also want to recommend a relatively recent story, Diamond Blanket Sky from 2019 by Busho Rodenberger. You can find it in his anthology Under a Black Rainbow, and this is a horrific and also tragic story that focuses centrally on a mass grave. Our adventure is going to start in a mass grave, so it's worth looking over Rodenberger's language about how to talk about such a thing, how to describe it, and emphasize how horrifying it is. And finally, and speaking of which, there's the adventure Graves Left Wanting from the 2022 release Heretic for the Rules Light TTRPG Merkborg. I love Merkborg, I love a lot of the adventures for Merkborg, and this one in particular seems to be one that's worth adapting for D&D, especially if you have a domain like Necropolis. So on that topic, let's turn to outline our adventure. In Act 1, at level 5, the PCs awaken at the bottom of an infinitely deep and infinitely populated mass grave. It's horrifying. As they make their way to the surface, we're going to adapt a huge chunk of the Merkborg adventure Graves Left Wanting. Then, in Act 2, at level 6, the PCs make their way across the city of Necropolis, passing through dangerous encounters which we've lifted and changed from Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, and ultimately ending up at the Castle of Death. Then, in Act 3, at level 7, the PCs are going to explore the Castle of Death in order to confront the Dark Lord himself. And for this, we're going to run a heavily edited and heavily nerfed version of Vanrak Doom from Dungeon of the Mad Mage. So let's begin. In Act 1, at level 5, the PCs wake up amid clearing mist. It's dark and they can barely see, but they should be able to figure out rather quickly that they're in a mass grave. They alone seem animate and conscious, but as they check their bearings, the PCs should each realize that they lack the telltale signs of life. They don't breathe, their hearts don't beat. It's as if they've died and then woken up in a mass grave. And here, for the purposes of the adventure, let's keep every PC's statistics the same, but just add that they don't need to breathe, eat, or sleep, or anything like that. They still need long rests, and they still recover the same way with long rests, and short rests too, for that matter. But we'll just say for this adventure that the PCs are rather moribund. Maybe they did die and wake up in this mass grave. Maybe this adventure would be fun to run after a TPK, especially a TPK in Ravenloft. But regardless, the PCs are faced with a choice. Do they try to climb up to the surface? Do they loot the bodies that are around them? Or do they crawl further into the dark, into a tunnel which they should be able to spot in the distance? Now, if the PCs attempt to climb to the surface, it proves futile. The bodies are endless, without number, and it seems as though the path upward is infinite. Indeed, it is. You should allow PCs to make checks to tell that attempts at ascent are futile, at least here. I think investigation or perception would be fine. Meanwhile, if PCs attempt to loot bodies nearby, they might find something, but they will be attacked by 1d4 ghouls. And since everyone is crammed into a mass grave, let's have everyone in combat be prone, or at least start out prone. With those two options ruled out, it looks like the PCs must head into the tunnel. And here we're going to start running a huge chunk of Graves Left Wanting, the Merkborg adventure. Heading further into the tunnels, the PCs come across a room full of sarcophagi. They're all empty except for one, which holds what looks like a dead body. In fact, however, it's an iron skeleton covered with heavily sculpted clay. If for some reason the PCs try to rip the clay off of the body, they find the iron skeleton, and inside the iron skeleton's ribcage is a glowing magical ruby gem, the Ruby of Thanatos. This ruby grants a +1 to every saving throw made by an attuned owner, but every time it grants such a bonus, it also makes the owner look more and more cadaverous, more and more like an undead monster. You might allow that after 20 uses, the owner becomes an undead monster. I don't know, sounds spooky. Anyway, from the sarcophagus room, the PCs have two options other than going back to the mass grave. They can head up a tunnel to the north, or they can head down a tunnel to the south. Those are the options, tunnel north or tunnel south. If the PCs head to the northern tunnel, they come to the Catacomb Corridor, a long and narrow corridor whose walls are lined with alcoves in which recline toothless skeletons. Each toothless skeleton has a pair of glittering coins in its eye sockets. If any PC attempts to touch or talk to the skeletons, they start up as if they were asleep, and then answer a few questions. They reveal that the PCs are indeed in the realm of the Necropolis, the city of the dead. They reveal that Necropolis is allegedly ruled by Death himself from a castle, and they also reveal that the PCs are a very special type of creature. Each of the PCs are not dead, they're deadent. What that means is that they died, but it didn't quite take. The PCs are not undead, they're not monsters, but the longer they stay in the realm of Necropolis, the closer and closer they will come to being undead monsters. For you see, as the skeletons grumpily reveal, there's always a trickle of deadent into the realm of Necropolis, and they all eventually become undead monsters, skeletons or ghouls or wraiths, and that's what the PCs are destined to become. That is, of course, unless they seek an audience with Death himself, and either successfully persuade him to let them go, or else defeat him in combat. That's pretty much all the skeletons have to reveal. I would also have them be grumpy and eager to go back to sleep, and we could say that they have the statistics of normal skeletons and they only engage in combat to either defend themselves or to defend the coins that are in their eye sockets. Now from the Catacomb Corridor, the PCs could either head further north, or they could take a tunnel that branches to the southeast. If the PCs continue further north of the Catacomb Corridor, they eventually come across the Roach Herder. The Roach Herder is an eccentric but friendly ghoul who befriends all kinds of insects and vermin. He's like a ghoul ranger, or maybe a ghoul druid? He recognizes the PCs for what they are, and he offers to serve as a guide to the Palace of Death, and, more immediately, out of this underground place. He's not going to do that work for free, however. To serve as a guide, he needs 2 of the many treasures that are scattered throughout this underground area. The Ruby of Thanatos is one. There's also the Corrosive Trumpet, the Gruel of the Grave, and the Unkey. We'll get to each of those in time. When given any 2 of those treasures, the Roach Herder agrees to serve as the PC's guide, and he casually flips a hidden switch that only he knows about, which opens a passage upward to the surface. Other than the Roach Herder and his verminous companions, the only interesting thing in the room is a wall-sized mirror. In the mirror, PCs can see shadows of their former selves. Literally, shadows. Shadowy versions of the PCs. I would have these shadowy versions of the PCs taunt the PCs, mock the PCs for how they died. And this could be a fun bit of creative roleplay. Let the PCs make up some stuff about how they died, either to embellish in it or to stage a little argument with their shadow self. You could also run Shadow of Your Former Self from Nerdarchy's Out of the Box here. That would be a fun thing to do. And here, of course, I'm drawing from some of the metaphysics that you can find in Wraith Oblivion as well. Anyway, assuming that the PCs don't have 2 treasures for the Roach Herder yet, They have to head back south into the catacomb corridor. If they branch off to the southeast of the catacomb corridor, this takes the PCs to an area called the Origin Fountain. The room features a huge, ornately carved fountain featuring statues of angels holding upturned urns. But instead of water, the fountain holds mist and fog, which also pours from the upturned urns. On the other side of the fountain, there's a stone doorway carved into the wall. And above the doorway, resting on a shelf, is an ornately carved vase or jar with a lid. Bridging the two sides of the fountain is a literal bridge, a smooth, slick, narrow stone surface that one could use to cross. Now importantly, this room has an anti-magic field that's generated by the fountain itself, so magic will not help here. The bridge is also particularly slick, so any PC who uses it to try to cross must succeed on a DC 18 dexterity-based check, I would say acrobatics or just straight dexterity, or else fall into the misty fountain. Now, anything inanimate that isn't being worn or carried disappears when dropped into the fountain. It's gone forever. But if a person or a living creature falls into the fountain, they immediately wake up in one of the alcoves in the catacomb corridor. They're aged, they're missing a bunch of teeth, and they have a very sharp and vivacious memory of living an entire different life, one that came to an end. Oh yeah, and they wake up with just one hit point, too. If the PCs successfully cross the bridge, however, either by making the dex check or just flying over it with natural flying abilities, they discover that the door is fake, it's just something that's carved into the wall. The vase, however, holds a magical substance, gruel of the grave. It's a kind of oatmeal, it's absolutely disgusting, but the undead love it. It's useless to the PCs then, but it could help them convince the roach herder to be their guide. Meanwhile, if the PCs head south of the sarcophagus room, they encounter a winding tunnel that can be full of traps and incorporeal undead. I would say specters, lots of specters. And at the other end of this winding tunnel, the PCs come to the colander room, so called because of the perforations in the ceiling through which mist and fog trickle. In the colander room, the PCs find a round table with 3 chairs. Seated in the chairs are skeletal vampire spawn. They have the statistics of vampire spawn, but they look like skeletons with exaggerated canines. Each skeleton is also dressed in fancy clothing, but the clothing is made of mist. The skeletons are also arguing. They wave their hands in the air and they make these angry gestures. And in the skeleton's jaws, you can see tongues wagging. It's just that the tongues are made of mist, and so nobody can hear what the skeletons are arguing about. Looking, however, the PCs might be able to infer something. There's a box, a big old metal box with a padlock holding it shut in the center of the table. Periodically, the skeletons will gesture to it and make disagreeing gestures. And one of the skeletons holds a dagger, which is carved so as to look like a key. It has little teeth at the end. So it might seem that the skeletons are arguing over who gets the dagger that's shaped like a key and what to do with the box. Indeed, a successful insight check, let's say DC 15, would reveal that. Now, the skeletons completely ignore the PCs no matter what the PCs do, unless the PCs either try to take the box, try to take the dagger shaped like a key, or attack the skeletons. If any of those things happen, the skeletons jump up and they fight as vampire spawn, but they otherwise don't even acknowledge anyone. Other than the way that the PCs came in, the only way out of this room is a door to the east that leads to another tunnel. If the PCs defeat the 3 skeletal vampire spawn, they get the dagger that's shaped like a key. This is the unkey. You can put it into any lock and open it. It's just that the unkey is also cursed in a weird way, where it causes whatever you open to have something funny on the other side, something unexpected and sometimes harmful. As for the box, it holds a bunch of silver, unless you open the box with the unkey, in which case it contains who knows what. Here's a table. Now, the room to the east of the colander room is a foul-smelling crypt. It smells bitter, like acid. And at the center, on a raised dais, is a marble coffin. The lid of the coffin is rattling and bubbling as acid flows and spews out of the coffin's body. PCs can approach the coffin just fine, but if they lift the lid, it's as if the spell Fireball was cast on that exact area, except that it's acid damage and not fire damage. There's an explosion of acid, in other words. But after that happens, the PCs can find inside the marble coffin a magic item, the corrosive trumpet. When sounded by an attuned user, the corrosive trumpet causes 1d6 acid damage to anyone who hears it. That includes allies and the user of the trumpet themselves. So, not very useful for the PCs, but it's something that the Roach Herder would accept as part of a price for his guidance. And speaking of which, once the PCs give 2 of the 4 magical treasures that are down here to the Roach Herder, he guides them up to the surface, the PCs reach level 6, and we proceed to Act 2. In Act 2, at level 6, the PCs must journey through the city of Necropolis, which has huge, towering crypts and mausoleums that look like some kind of cross between graveyard architecture and Art Deco skyscrapers. And of course, there's all manner of wandering undead. So to curate the experience of the PCs going through the city of Necropolis, I would take some encounters from Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, specifically the chapter El Turel Has Fallen, and change them in the following way. For the encounter Collapsed Building, I would change the innocent lawful good dwarven healers to a bunch of zombies who just sound like they're moaning in despair when the house collapses on them. Replace the devils who might show up upon hearing the noise with a single wraith, and of course eliminate any mention of or interest in High Hall, El Turel, or Avernus, or anything like that. Now with the encounter Cry for Help, we're going to change this a bit. We're going to say that a Nosferatu named Salome recognizes the Roach Herder. She approaches the PCs and insists that she would be a much better guide. She insists that the PCs take her as a guide and abandon the Roach Herder. If the PCs do this, she betrays them at the first opportunity, attacking them when it seems opportune, and then fleeing once she's down to half her hit points. If the PCs don't accept her offer, however, she'll become hostile, attack, and then again flee once she's down to half her hit points. As for the encounter Ghoul Pack, I would just run it the same way, don't change a thing. With the encounter Hateful Patrol, just replace the patrol with a single zombie clot that's barreling its way down Necropolis's streets. And for Imp Sales Pitch, I would replace this with a very particular sort of Banshee encounter. The Banshee that the PCs find is confused and doesn't realize that it's dead, or rather undead. It says that it's lost, it cannot remember its name, it's confused, it doesn't know what's going on, it's afraid that it might be dead, and it beseeches the PCs for help. Now, if the Banshee learns that it is in fact undead, it's going to cry and wail and become hostile. So the PCs just need to politely extract themselves from this conversation, or trick the Banshee into thinking that it's in fact alive. It's a fun encounter, I think. Based on a similar encounter from the Sierra online point-and-click adventure game Quest for Glory 4 Shadows of Darkness, if you're interested. As for the encounter Narzugon Cavalier, I would change it to a single Barrowghast that's just wandering through Necropolis. A Barrowghast is of course an undead giant. You can find the statistics in Big B Presents Glory of the Giants. And unlike the original encounter where the PCs have to hide or else they'll die, I would say that the PCs can hide. The Barrowghast is pretty tough for their level after all, but if they decide to attack, they could also gain surprise on the creature. That should even the odds. Still an encounter where they're encouraged to hide and watch the spooky monster go by, but not one that limits them to that. As for the encounter Spouts of Hellfire, I would change the charred dead body to a frozen dead body, and then change the Blast of Hellfire that does fire damage to a Blast of Freezing Mist that does cold damage. Otherwise, everything's the same. Then there's Vrock Philosophy. I love this encounter. This encounter is so cool. There just aren't enough points in D&D where the PCs get to encounter a horrible monster, like an evil monster that has a completely alien perspective, and talk to it. But that's what we've got here, and it's awesome. I would just change the Vrock to a Skeletal Knight from Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen. Or if not that, some high-level sophisticated undead monster. A ghost, maybe. And finally, there's the encounter Zombie Horde. Change nothing, just run that as it is. Now, along with these encounters, you could have the PCs forage for supplies and maybe find some random goods. They might be able to barricade a building and rest in it, for instance. But once the PCs have wandered for a while and undergone a few of these encounters, say that they reach the Castle of Death. At that point, they level up to 7, and we proceed to Act 3. And for Act 3, at level 7, we're going to run Vanrak Doom from Dungeon of the Mad Mage, but we're going to change it quite a bit. We're going to lower a lot of the challenges in that dungeon so it's suitable for level 7 PCs. We're going to nerf it, as they say. Now, overall, Vanrak Doom is a really neat dungeon. It's a scary, morbid, undead-filled place that also is haunted by memories of a traumatized monster. Originally, it tells the tragic tale of a bronze dragon who got corrupted and turned into a shadow dragon. In our reskinned version, it's going to tell the story of Llewellyn Dasheen and how he became the negative energy elemental called Death. The PCs still start at Area 1, that's where they enter, but at Area 3 I would replace the statue of Shar with a statue of Death. Keep everything else the same, especially the hallucinatory kneeling figure. I love that encounter. Then, in Area 4, replace the projection of Umbraxakar with a projection of Death. That is a smoky figure that looks like Death, looks like the Grim Reaper. As for the dragon's vision in Area 4, I would replace it with a different vision. A vision of Azalin, the Lich King, a kingly-looking lich who looks at the viewer with some degree of admiration, or at least seriousness, and says, "You are my sharpest pupil, Llewellyn Dasheen," and then the vision ends. Then, in Area 5, replace the dragon's vision with a different vision, where the viewer is handing Azalin the Lich King a document, a contract that's signed in blood. In the vision, the PCs can see that the name signed in blood is Llewellyn Dasheen. Upon receiving the contract, the kingly lich Azalin says, "Yes, good. This is necessary for the process. We shall laugh at what a small thing this document was later when you have achieved true power." Then the vision ends. And sure enough, after the vision, the PCs can find in that chamber that very document, the contract signed with Llewellyn's name in blood, although the rest of it has become faded to the point of illegibility. In Area 6, remove the gate to some other level of Undermountain. We don't want that here, it's not in Undermountain. And in Area 7A and 7B, just replace all the cultists with skeletons. You can say that the skeletons wear robes and they still chant that weird depressing chant, but statistically they're skeletons. And in Area 7C, let there just be one vampire spawn, just one. In Area 8, of course, we're going to replace the smoky projection of Umbraxakar with a smoky projection of Death, and we're also going to change the dragon's vision. In Area 8, the vision that the PCs get is of the kingly lich Azalin gesturing towards a ceremonial circle, a pentagram or something scary that's drawn on the floor with a bunch of candles and other spooky accoutrements, with Azalin saying, "This is the ritual that will give you true power." Then the vision ends, and the PCs can find the hilt of a functioning sun sword there. In Area 9, replace each cultist with a chanting robed skeleton and get rid of the rats. In Area 10, replace each cult fanatic with a boneless from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and when each boneless dies, let it spawn a shadow, rather than a shadow assassin, to fight the PCs. In Area 12A, I would replace the bat swarms with swarms of zombie limbs, and in Area 13B, I would just have every coffin be empty. It not only lowers the difficulty level, but also places in the players' minds the idea that there's vampires running around here. In Area A15, the throne room, we're going to change the smoky projection of Umbraxakar, again with a smoky vision of Death, and we're going to change the dragon's vision to another vision. In this one, the viewer looks up at Azalin, presumably from a prone position, as Azalin howls curses of anger and disappointment. He calls the viewer a mistake, a botched job, a failure, and then the vision ends. If the PCs find and take the mithril armor, we're going to change the shadow assassins that arise to just 5 regular shadows. That's it, just 5 regular shadows. Then in Area 16, we're going to get rid of the gateway that leads to some other part of Undermountain. Again, we don't need it and don't want it. And in Area 17, we're going to replace the dragon's vision with one where the viewer is looking down at Azalin, as if floating in air, with Azalin saying in astonishment, "This shouldn't be possible. How is this possible? You should be destroyed. And yet you've become what I could only imagine is a negative energy elemental. This needs more research." And then the vision ends. In Area 18, we're going to lower the damage of the necrotic curtain, say that it only does 11 necrotic damage or half on a save. And we're going to say that only 2 wraiths arise rather than 6 when the PCs pass through. Also, the DC to force the door should be 22 rather than 28. Now, in Area 19, we still have the hallucinatory magic mouth thing that appears and recites the poem, but we're going to change the poem to this. The magic mouth recites, "Remember, souls, as you walk by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you will be. Prepare for death and follow me." And of course, we're going to replace the dragon's vision. In this vision, Azalin is mocking the viewer and cackling wildly, saying, "Are you serious? Listen to yourself. You really think that you're the avatar of death? You are not an avatar. You are not a god. You are the lowly human Llewellyn Dasheen. Do not make me sneer." And then the vision ends. In Area 20, of course, we're going to replace the smoky projection of Umbraxakar with a smoky projection of Death. And if you didn't run the encounter Shadow of Your Former Self from Nerdarchy's Out of the Box yet, this would be a cool place to run it. Just say that there's a huge mirror on the wall in Area 20. As for Area 22, just replace all the statues of Vanrak Moonstar with statues of a different young man, Llewellyn Dasheen, before his transformation. And as for the dragon's vision in Area 22, replace it with a vision of being chased into the mists, being pursued by Azalin and a team of mounted undead. That's right, cackles Azalin, flee into the mists, flee like the coward you are, and remember you are nothing more than human. And then the vision fades. In Area 25A, let there just be one vampire spawn. And in Area 25B, let there be a ghost of an adventurer rather than an actual adventurer. She does have helpful information, though. She points out that Death could become flustered and distracted and disorganized and break down if sufficiently reminded of his former life. She also reveals that Death can be defeated in combat, too, although it is very risky, for he is a peerless foe. As for Area 26, change Caresta to a Nosferatu. Replace her 9 vampire spawn minions with 9 Sturges instead, and say that the Sturge's creature type is undead rather than beast, and that they look like skeletal bats. I think that's cool. And like a normal vampire, let's say that Caresta turns into mist when reduced to 0 hit points, and that mist flees to the coffin that's located in Area 31. In Area 28C, replace the 3 Shadow Assassins with 2 vampire spawn. And in Area 30, have the bas relief depict Death rather than Shar, and have the DC to open the door be 22 rather than 28. In Area 31, again, change the bas relief so that it shows Llewellyn Dasheen kneeling before the Lich King Azalin, with the latter figure being labeled. I would delete Area 33, we don't actually need it. And finally, in Area 32, get rid of all the monsters and replace them with the Dark Lord Death. He looks like a Grim Reaper without the scythe, and he's a large-sized undead creature. I would give him the statistics of a Nightwalker, but cut all of his damage in half, cut his attack bonuses in half, rounding up, change the DC to resist his attacks from 21 down to 16, and finally give him 3 uses of legendary resistance. Death, of course, demands to know the reason for the PC's trespass into his realm and into his castle, and he announces his intent to kill them. Now, PCs can use their action to attempt a DC 18 persuasion or intimidation check to remind Death that he is in fact only human. They must make these checks in battle, however, because battle immediately commences. Now, if the PCs either reduce Death to 0 hit points, or they make 3 such checks during battle, they witness a fantastic scene. Amid a sudden earthquake, countless skeletal limbs suddenly reach up from the ground, clawing and grasping at the air. They grasp the PCs, and as the room floods with Shadowfell mist, the PCs are dragged down into a pit, a mass grave not unlike the one that they just woke up in not long before. And where the PCs end up next is up to the DM. So that's our adventure in Necropolis. What do you think? Does that domain sound interesting to you? Should they have included it in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft? And how would you have handled this strange domain of the entirely undead? Let me know in the comments. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to do all the internet things. Click like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon if you want notifications about new videos on this channel. And thanks!